As we continue to settle into our new work-from-home environment, organizations are finding themselves dealing with both the short-term and long-term effects of a global health crisis, along with a changing cybersecurity threat landscape. Not surprisingly, cybercriminals are tailoring their attacks to the COVID-19 pandemic and are preying on the range of emotions it has brought on for all of us: stress, boredom, distraction, loneliness, urgency, curiosity, and fear, to name a few. According to KnowBe4, phishing attacks have increased 667% in the month of March alone. Therefore, security awareness within your organization is arguably more important now than ever before. Security awareness during COVID-19. Thank you for joining us today for a live webinar as we explore actual COVID-19 cyber threats, highlight the importance of remaining cyber aware during COVID-19, and why ongoing security awareness training and testing is crucial during these trying times.
Hey, it's Mike Gravel with GraVoc Associates and Vice President of Information Security and IT here. So as you know, we're here to talk about security awareness in COVID-19. We feel it's a particularly important topic because we have more and more of our customers working remotely today, and that introduces a bunch of changes to kind of how they work and what they're seeing out there in the world of cybersecurity. So we're going to touch upon a bunch of points here, but first I'd like to introduce Brian Brunelle. He's going to be joining me today to give some commentary on what he's seeing out there with our customers. We got 5 points today to get to. Basically, we're talking about how COVID-19 is reshaping the future of cybersecurity. We're talking about how COVID-19 is reshaping the future of technology and how we work. Then we're going to jump into kind of some of the attacks that we see out in the wild, so to speak. Talk about security awareness training and the importance of that during this time. I know it's a touchy subject, and we'll get into some of the do's and don'ts. And then we'll take a look also at, that bigger question of to phish or not to phish in terms of testing your users during this time. So there's the training piece and the testing piece. We'll address those separately and then kind of bring them together. So just to start off on the COVID-19, how it's reshaping or shaping the future of cybersecurity, I think the number one point that we want to bring home here is that it's changing the threat landscape that our employees are seeing, that our businesses are seeing, and what does that mean for security awareness efforts. So in the months, well, it feels like months, it's been weeks, obviously, of the work from home environment that we're all living in now. Most of us are living in now. There's been some changes to kind of how we work, and that obviously has, for better or for worse, made us change kind of the way that we approach risk and our risk appetite. And so there's been a shift in kind of our risk profile that's essentially been forced on us as we try to preserve continuity of operations and respond to the pandemic that we're in. And so as the intro mentioned, that obviously brings about a lot of different emotions from our employees and from our organization as a whole, our management teams, our boards, things like that. So we want to be sensitive to those, but also understand what that means in terms of the security of our organizations. What that essentially brings about is a need for additional training, and training and testing of employees is probably on the last one of the last things on people's minds as they just try to get by in these times and respond to the situation that we're in. But it is very important in terms of keeping our organization secure. So we'll get a little bit further into that in a moment. We also see kind of a decision point where are we spinning up a bunch of corporate-owned devices and making a mad dash to do that, or are we loosening restrictions on bring your own device? So that all has security implications, of course, and how we architect our networks and our applications and really our organization as a whole. Where do we apply controls and how, and then validating whether that's effective. All of this brings about changes to corporate culture. Obviously, when I talk about risk appetite, we kind of talk about corporate culture hand in hand. And the underpinnings of all this is disaster recovery, business continuity, and obviously pandemic preparedness. And what we wrote in our plans, what we're practicing today, the delta between those things and how to rectify those in a meaningful way, as throughout the response, which is looking like it's going to be a pretty long haul. So hopefully we're seeing some sort of flattening of the curve as we hear in the news. So, Brian, I don't know if you had anything to add to that statistically, or if you wanted to kind of give your 2 cents on what you've been seeing from our customer base or anything like that.
So we've been all over the place. Again, I'm Brian. I'm the director of risk management and audit. I'm doing everything from auditing and risk assessing these new technologies that our clients are putting in place to having conversations with them about, what's the right opportunity and what's the right solution for what they're trying to meet. And it's been interesting, of course, our customer base is all over the map in terms of, where they were previously, in terms of remote work and what they had allowed and didn't allow. And some of them are at the mercy of the legacy hardware they had in place and legacy systems that they're dealing with, versus some others that might have been, more progressive in pursuing, more current and newer hardware that, maybe they were kind of already prepared for this situation and just needed to open up a couple more, doors to allow for more remote work capability versus, having to run out and try to purchase and implement, a full remote work VPN, laptops, hardware situation. So we're seeing it from all sides right now. It's been a very interesting time to be an information security consultant. And overall, again, I think, Nate, we're going to talk about more issues as we go through here, but there's a lot of focuses to consider here. And do you want me to dive into incident response and that piece of it, or how do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, we can talk about that. I think ultimately we'll talk about incident response and maybe zero trust model, and then kind of dive into the culture piece of things, and because I think it brings about our second point, which is really how is this reshaping how we think about the way that we approach work, and then what actionable items are coming out of this in terms of from a technology standpoint. We have a lot of customers that are saying, hey, we're getting the laptops back as soon as this thing is over, and there's others that are saying, this way of working makes a lot of sense to our organization, and if we could take it back, we would have done X, Y, and Z better. But moving forward, this is our plan of attack, and this is how we're going to prepare for future events. Hopefully not as drastic as this one, but future events that would take us out of our normal operations and be better prepared for that. So yeah, why don't we dive into incident response a little bit, and then we can bring it back to the technology piece with remote work and VDI and public cloud and all that good stuff.
Sure. And one other stat to add, the graphic we had talked at the beginning of this talked about the spike in the number of, phishing emails that we've seen, obviously very related to the COVID situation. I think another good stat to have out there and have in your minds as we go through this conversation is the spike in remote work. That goes without saying that companies have been, mandated basically to, have employees work remotely or close their physical locations. And some estimates have that going from roughly 20% of the workforce to now 80% as we're in, COVID response times. So, just that significant hike is obviously, caused the changing to the threat landscape and the risk appetite that you mentioned beforehand. So, DRBCP, that's disaster recovery and business continuity planning and incident response, those aspects go kind of hand in hand. Obviously, pandemic planning is something where, if you were fortunate enough to be, a regulated industry like a lot of the financial institutions that we happen to work with, DR, BCP, pandemic testing are things you were familiar with, and, maybe not have fully turned the switches on all of that testing, but you at least had those concepts in mind, where if you were outside of those regulated industries, this concept could be entirely new to you. So basically, what you would talk about in those scenarios is a situation like COVID hits. How do you respond when you have to close your physical location? How do you carry out your key activities? If your core business is really reliant upon 4, 5, 6, or 20 individuals, how do you account for them to continue to, in this changing work environment, continue that core operation? The other side of that is the incident response component, where now you're having these employees work from their house, or for any internet connection is really basically the goal of remote work here. And, with the changing threats and the changing of the architecture, can you still reasonably detect if you have a disaster coming at you, or you're in the middle of this disaster and someone's, falling victim to a phishing attack? Is your incident response program robust enough? Do you have the monitoring and the controls in place that, to support those core activities, you can protect those end users? So, obviously this is going to be kind of a trial by fire for a lot of businesses here, where, they didn't really fully consider these things, and now they're kind of adjusting that on the fly. But it's also, in that challenge is also the opportunity of, okay, now we've seen this, we've responded to it, we understand, what these response measures are looking like, and now what's the best way to tighten that up? And, as Nate alluded to, what's that going to look like going forward? This COVID situation is going to resolve at some point. And are you going to, still enable that remote work and have that for the next disaster? Or are you going to, bundle that all back up and put it back away and put it in a closet somewhere for the next time? So we had mentioned the zero trust model. I think, it's important to talk about as we continue to kind of blur the boundary of, what's the work environment. The old model was the castle/moat model, where, you had your business, you had your physical location, and, you could you protect the perimeter because that's where all the bad would come from. And once something was allowed in, you generally trusted that it was safe and they were who they were. The zero trust model, again, now as you change your attack surface, which, you go from having, all your users connecting to the internet or your locations or your applications, from inside of your network to, again, from their houses, from Starbucks, from wherever else they may be, not Starbucks because that's closed right now, but, wherever else they may be, how do you account for that? How do you keep security? And the zero trust model basically says you continually are forcing, people to prove, to authenticate, to recertify that they are who they are, so that you can trust. So there's a lot of, layers of security that go into that. Everything from, initial authentication, having, IP restrictions and device control and mobile device management and multi-factor, to identity access management as they're signing in. So sign-in risk of if they're connecting from a new device, if, how many times can they type in their password incorrectly before getting locked out, to real-time risk analytics of, what's their user behavior, what's their normal login time, what's expected, and then are they doing other things? So it's starting to, again, taking this whole COVID situation, determining, what your response is going to be and how you're going to carry this forwards after the COVID situation starts to resolve, and looking at, what are some of the security architectures we can be implementing. So, the next time there's a situation, or, even if it's a snowstorm and we want to have everybody work from home, well, we're very confident now that after going through this COVID situation, we can do that securely.
Yeah, and I think bringing this back to security awareness, it's really making your end users aware of why those controls are in place, to a certain degree, giving them training on how to make the controls more effective, because let's face it, where there's a will, there's a way. A lot of end users will take the path of least resistance in terms of connectivity and making their jobs a little bit easier on themselves. Not to say that that's malicious in any way or done maliciously, but it's definitely a concern when you're talking about your security architecture and how you're managing to keep the operation secure. I think, the good and bad news for organizations in all this is that the technology is available. I say that because as a matter of convenience and of the way that we're getting through the day-to-day now is that the technology allows us to do that. The problem for security professionals like us and like some of you in the audience today is that the convenience factor does often lead to security vulnerabilities. So we talk about some of the major kind of future shaping technology changes that this has brought about, and you talk about remote access and work from home, but one of the big ones is collaboration tools. So you have obviously a bunch of different platforms, and we've seen each of our customers go kind of a different road to do video-based conferencing and do chats and file sharing a little bit more easily, and just general collaboration. We've all heard the stories about Zoom in the headlines, and what that can mean in terms of confidentiality and security of data, but also there are privacy concerns that go along with collaboration tools as well, in terms of how chats are being recorded and logged, and our video conferences. Where does that all end up, and what is being discussed on those calls that can and can't be recorded? My guess is that all the people that ran out and joined Zoom probably didn't take a really exhaustive look at their privacy statement and what is and isn't captured in each session, and what the guidelines are there. So there's a lot of considerations just in that, those collaboration tools and the capabilities that those give us, which are great in terms of productivity, and not so great in terms of having a complete handle on where data is going and how it's being protected throughout. So really making employees aware of the do's and don'ts of these new technologies, whether that be through an acceptable use or end user guideline type policy or additional training. I mean, we use KnowBe4 for our training and testing. And there are models in training videos specific to work from home, public Wi-Fi. Obviously, we're not doing too much public Wi-Fi these days, since most things are locked down. But and we're staying away from the public spaces these days. But there's all sorts of resources that you can give your employees to say, hey, this is kind of how our intention for these new set of tools and how we want to see you using them. You always have to assume good intent in terms of your employee base and how they're using the technology you provide to them. But there's an education factor that goes along with that, if not provided, could lead to some of these vulnerabilities and pitfalls that we've talked about. So we do plan on doing another session, I believe, on VDI and public cloud in particular. I do want to touch upon them here, but we'll probably get more in depth at a later date. But it has a lot of our customers. This situation has a lot of our customers looking very carefully at the benefits of virtual desktop interface, as opposed to going out and buying 60 laptops on the fly, and in some cases in this situation running into a breakdown in the supply chain and not being able to get those from their traditional sources, and having to go out to Staples and Best Buy and wherever else that they can get their hands on the hardware. And it has, on the VDI front, there's obviously public cloud providers that make that very achievable in a short period of time. Microsoft Azure and AWS spaces in particular, where customers might already have a presence in some form or another. they took a lot of our customers are taking a hard look at that, not only in this situation, but going forward, to see if that makes better sense for the organization in the long run. So there's a lot of things that I think were in the far future of our customers, strategic planning efforts that have definitely moved up in priority due to this, pandemic situation that we find ourselves in today. And then, of course, wrapped in all that is how that changes the way that we approach security for our operation. So I think that covers points 1 and 2. I want to kind of move into our point 3, which is just examples of some of the COVID-19 cyber attacks that we've seen to date. We're not going to belabor each and every one of these, but these are, again, pulled from our resource with KnowBe4. They've put together a nice set of examples. So we haven't seen all of these ourselves in the wild, but we have seen our fair share of them and just the different angles that they're taking. I mean, obviously representing the World Health Organization, even down to very targeted attacks on, absenteeism. So knowing that people aren't in the office, and doing business the way that they're normally doing. So they're seeing more threats for, pretending to be the IT department or pretending to be a high-level manager or in the C-suite and saying, I need to get things done. We need to get this application filed for the CARES Act and things like that. Basically taking advantage of the situation and the fact that, people are still settling into and getting used to the new way of doing work remotely and not having, that close physical connection where they might walk over to somebody's office and say, hey, does this look legit? They might not think twice about it in this particular scenario because everybody is working through email and collaboration tools and things like that. So, so there's certainly a ton of examples. As we cited, the spike in March alone was pretty significant. And anytime there's something like this, we see the attackers kind of taking full advantage and ramping up their efforts to see if they can, kind of kick you while you're down, for lack of a better term. So, Brian, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that. I know that you put together a nice example that I think eventually went into our company blog or one of our social media sites about, some of the stuff we've been seeing.
No, I mean, certainly a little bit to add here. I think you covered it pretty nicely. I think one thing to take advantage of is anything that the FBI is, they put out their flash alerts. They're referred to as anything they're alerting on is obviously something that's bubbling up for a pretty significant level for them to get involved and put out a public communication on. And most recently, they've talked about, warning about the teleconferencing. So as you were talking about with Zoom, and then anything related to, online classrooms and hijacking those situations, to taking advantage of anything related to COVID-19. So, it's unfortunate that it happens. We see it all the time, whether it, was, recent events where Hurricane Harvey or something like the Marathon bombing, where anytime there's any sort of incident or, public tragedy, unfortunately, the bad guys see that just as an opportunity to sweep in and say, okay, people are going to be clicking on information related to this. They're going to want to donate to charities. In this case, they're knowing that all these people are going to be working from home. Maybe the CEO, really, walks down the hall and talks about sending that wire out or, processing that payment. And now he's sending that email. So business email compromise is a big concern at this time. And the other angle of that is if you're a MSP or, another vendor or service provider, you're becoming targets too, the even the heightened target now. Same reason. The bad guys, the fraudsters, the hackers, they know that, these other businesses are relying upon you more and more. So it might be something saying, hey, where you're right, it goes in both directions of, saying, hey, I'm your IT provider and I need to remote to your machine. And that's, a malicious email, or it could be an email to that IT support provider saying, hey, I'm such and such that works with, I work at GraVoc and I can't get on my work computer. Can you have this? And now they're attacking the vendor in that way. So again, it's just being vigilant that the situation is constantly evolving, and anything related to the current news cycle or something that's front and center like that, the fraudsters will try to take advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on your last point, being an MSP ourselves, we've seen both of those types of attacks. We've seen people impersonating us from a support perspective, but also from an admin perspective, sending fake invoices or invoices appearing to be from us and saying, hey, due to the situation, we're now kind of moving to this invoicing system, because we don't have anybody at the office, or whatever the language might be. So there's multiple attempts just that we've seen with our own brand on our customers, and some of them, might not necessarily be our customers, but the attackers thought it was, worth the effort and worth a try. Yeah, it's certainly a very real attack vector that we're seeing out there. Again, just exploiting the changes to that everybody's dealing with. So I think that kind of leads us into our next major point about the importance of security awareness training during these times. I mean, obviously, the number one factor is that our employees are going through a lot of different changes. And whenever that happens, we need to make sure that they understand kind of what not only the do's and don'ts are, but what can they expect? What should they be looking out for? These phishing attack examples in KnowBe4, these are one way to train. They're also, another way to see how effective that training is, which we'll get into in a second. So anytime there's a change to the organization like the one that this situation has brought about, it's always important to educate and to train on, what that means for them. Also, not to be draconian, but also to have them understand and acknowledge what acceptable use of the new technology is. So if you've rolled out VPN or you've rolled out collaboration tools as part of this, having them understand what they can and can't do while using those tools. And of course, you can put technical restrictions in place, but the majority of our customers barely had time to formulate a plan for some of this, let alone do any sort of deep dive on hardening and validation testing of those controls, which obviously are important activities, but the number one priority was to get people connected and working and to maintain and continue operations as quickly as possible. And so the safety net for not having those technical controls to a certain degree is making sure that your users are understanding not only how to use the technology, but how to use it in a secure fashion and what they shouldn't necessarily be doing with those new tools. So there's a big piece of that. And then the third, probably biggest reason is that the attackers, aren't going to stop in all of this. In fact, they're going to ramp up their efforts as we've seen. Anytime you have a situation like this, it actually presents itself as an opportunity for a lot of people that are trying to gain access to things they shouldn't have access to, and exploit and gain financially from a situation like this one. So there's a couple major reasons why we should continue training. Is it at the top of everyone's list? Probably not. As I said before, I mean, there's a lot of things taking priority just to make sure that we keep moving our organizations forward from an operational perspective. But to pause on training altogether, or to not introduce new training to respond to some of these changes is not only a missed opportunity, but could be potentially harmful to the organization in the long run. So, Brian, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but it seems like a couple of our customers are, taking different approaches, and maybe you can talk a bit about, the dialogue you've had with some of them.
Sure. Well, I think for starters, for the most part, any of our information security clients have, very clearly understood that, training is pertinent, especially during this time. Again, users are connecting in new ways through different technologies. And again, the opportunity here is, not seeing security as a hindrance. Security is something that's going to allow you to implement these remote work and new technologies effectively and safely. There's more and more regulations that are starting to be passed down, whether it's, GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Protection Acts, things of those nature. So there's a regulatory aspect to it and a compliance aspect, but also, you don't want to be the next company that's in that headline of they got breached and, their personal information got out there, or they got ransomware and their operation is shutting down. Implementing the security training, by its nature, the human aspect is always going to be the soft spot. You can have technical controls in place, but you need employees to be able to connect in, and you need them to be able to do that securely so that, they can work. So having that training in place of, what are the things to watch out for? What are the additional risks to be concerned about when you're connecting from home, or, from a personal device, or even from a, company issued device? What are the additional steps that you need to be taking to ensure, the security of, your company's information and operation in that time? So again, I think all of our clients have embraced that training. Training is key as they're rolling this out. We've had, a couple clients that as they were, kind of rushing to get the hardware and the technologies in place, they were concurrently running, training courses of, hey, here's what this is going to look like for you. Here's what you should be doing at home. Here's how, here's a couple tips for, home computer security. So those types of things, again, as you blur that line of, where's business, where's home, and where can business be conducted from, making sure that your security training addresses those different aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, a good point in terms of, obviously educating the users, but having them, kind of fully commit to the new norm, so to speak, because you mentioned ransomware, and this response effort just on the pandemic front is challenging enough. To add something like that into the mix, could obviously be very detrimental to your operation and stop it dead in its tracks. Fortunately, amongst our customer base, we have not seen anything of that nature to date, but everybody's on, that the ransomware organizations, or, cyber criminals, I believe a couple weeks ago said, being the good Samaritans we are, we're not going to attack hospitals during this crisis, but that leaves the rest of us still on the hook for that. So, we want to make sure that we're doing the proper training of our employees to not get to a situation like that. And obviously you have your technical controls as a fallback. Another thing that we've seen as part of all this is the introduction of multi-factor authentication and next-gen antivirus as part of the strategy. But, all those controls need fine-tuning. And some of us haven't really had the time to get to that and validate those controls. So again, the safety net is the training in this particular scenario. So I guess that leads us to our last point on whether the big question of the genesis of the seminar topic that we have today, which is to phish or not to phish security awareness testing during COVID-19. And this one has been a little bit more of a debated topic. I think most people are on board with the training aspect, but the validation of that training and taking a look under the hood in terms of what would happen if somebody didn't do what they were supposed to and fell victim to one of these attacks. It seems that there's definitely some reluctance amongst our customer base of, should we? It's hard enough on the employees already. Should we really introduce this type of a test scenario or this type of a challenge into the mix when they're already dealing with so many other challenges? And obviously our perspective is biased because it comes from mostly a security one, which is, yes, of course you should test, but is there a tasteful way to do that testing? And is there a balance that we can strike to, make it so that you're really doing the testing as an extension of your training and education program, as opposed to saying, haha, I gotcha, and making it a draconian type of exercise where we're really just telling people that they're not doing what they're supposed to. You don't want to get into that. I mean, there's ways that we can do this testing to make sure that the training is taking in the communication and everything that you're doing to kind of increase awareness at this time is working, versus just involving people in a test that's more of a gotcha, or is really going to kind of have a negative impact on culture. Because right now, I think most of the efforts as a management team at GraVoc that we're undertaking is just making sure not only that the operation is continuing forward, but that our people are taken care of. And how do you effectively do that while at the same time, making sure through simulated phishing testing that we're not opening up vulnerabilities, in the human aspect of our security programs. So I think that the test exercises do have to happen. I think obviously most places have a program in place that they're doing testing on a normal basis anyway. And at some point throughout this time, they are going to be testing. But I think there's a way that we can acknowledge the sensitivity of the situation, but still emphasize the importance of testing.
Thank you, Nate. Again, I think you covered that topic pretty thoroughly, but I'll add a few more components here. I mean, one thing I think that's important to keep in mind is, as we talked about, training, culture, the different type of attacks that are going on, the number one, aspect of a breach that we're seeing, it has not changed in the past couple of years. It's been a phishing email that gets into somebody's inbox, whether it has a malicious link or a malicious download or embedded in it, really then tying that into some sort of credential compromise. So, again, whether you're choosing to phish or not to phish, that's the number one way that that's the number one likelihood of the way that your business would be compromised. Again, a phishing email comes in, somebody clicks on it, and that really leads to some sort of credential compromise. Then they pivot, they move through your network that way. So again, certainly phishing testing would address that component if you're vulnerable to that nature, to that attack. In terms of what we've been talking about with our existing customer base here, again, it's been different flavors depending upon their culture. So we've had plenty of places that have said, they've just been going through, it's been enough of a change, enough stress on their employees during this environment and during this COVID situation where, they don't feel comfortable testing. They just want to draw the line at training and, didn't want to put any more undue stress on their employees. Okay. We certainly respect that decision. I, again, would echo what Nate said, that, this type of phishing training should be happening, especially at this time, for the reasons that we've been talking about. And, for the spike in the number of phishing attempts that we've been talking about, you can't stick your head in the sand when it comes to this risk. Unfortunately, other customers have, just kind of pushed ahead and said, hey, if the bad guys are still doing it, we want to keep up with our, testing program. And we've continued to do phishing tests for these customers. And, we've even done some that's specific to the COVID angles and trying to exploit and seeing who's vulnerable in those situations. Again, that's, on the farther end of the spectrum. There's certainly a middle ground to be found. Others have, more recently we've talked about, okay, as this situation was first starting to evolve, that was not the right time to do testing. But now we're kind of in a status quo here where people are getting a little bit comfortable working from home, and we're looking at this for the foreseeable future. So now maybe you're over that initial, adjustment curve and that hump. Now might be a time where you could start to consider, phishing as a more viable option. So again, we're seeing it from all aspects. We're happy to, talk to you about, what you're doing currently, what else you could be doing, what's a tasteful way to do it. I mean, the other side of it, this is a big culture piece. Our approach, within GraVoc, whether we're using KnowBe4 or with any of our clients is, these phishing tests are a learning opportunity. They're just an extension of your training program. It's not, oh, that was terrible that you clicked. It's, hey, you clicked, here's what you could have done differently. Here's the things that you could have recognized. It's never something that we're escalating to, hey, you're going to forfeit your remote work capabilities if you can't pass this phishing test or anything like that. It's just continuing training, and realistically, as, an information security guy, I look at, phishing, who's clicking on phishing links of, am I doing a good job with my security awareness program? Am I getting the right information to people in a meaningful way, that they're digesting it and taking it to heart and now using that information to protect them? Or are they going through my, 45-minute training that I've assigned and, just letting it run in the background and not getting much out of that? So again, it's also a validation on the testing side or on the training side. Are you doing the right things in the right ways and delivering through the proper mediums to be catching people's attention and keeping this topic at the forefront of their mind?
Yeah, and I think what you said about, now that the dust has settled is a good point in terms of understanding, the attack surface that all this represents. So, the longer the situation goes on, the greater technically our attack surface is to, these types of, attacks based on COVID-19. And so, it becomes increasingly important to pick up where you left off in terms of validation testing. So, simulated phishing testing would be one of those validation tests. And, to do those tests as this progresses and as we, continue with the remote work and work from home atmosphere is, paramount in terms of making sure that your security is where it needs to be throughout the pandemic response. So we've done quite a bit of talking, and I'm sure we've missed a whole bunch of things that we probably could have touched upon. But what we'll do is we'll let our audience keep us honest and open it up to some questions that points that we might not have made that we can have a little dialogue on with the remaining time here.
Okay. Looks like we got a few questions here. The first one is, do you think with the current norm, there could be a shift to work from home part-time going forwards? So, talking about all these remote work capabilities that we've talked about, everyone rushing to implement as a response to the COVID situation here. Obviously, we talked about that a lot today. And, what that is going to look like as this COVID situation starts to resolve. Obviously, that's going to be on a company by company basis. I definitely think, especially for, the organizations that weren't as familiar with the pandemic planning type solutions and considering and testing these things before, they're obviously going to take this to heart and take it again, as we've been saying, as an opportunity to, improve their infrastructure and capabilities going forwards. So I definitely think that's going to be the case. Generally, if you're investing in, technologies and hardware that you're going to implement, it's not the best solution to try to put those all away and expect them to work again, 6 months later or 2 years later or whatever the next event is that's going to require, remote work. So I think you'll see a big culture shift here. And, a lot of organizations, you kind of had that, this is the way we did it mentality. So, maybe that's why, you were more used to going into an office and being seen. But as companies are starting to learn that they can be productive and employees are getting, more comfortable with working from home and being productive working from home, you're going to see those opportunities continue. You're going to want to maintain this capability going forward. That's going to provide a more flexible working environment. So I definitely think there'll be a shift. There will be, more companies embracing the, at least part-time work from home. But again, obviously that would be on a company by company basis. Nate, anything to add there, or you want to tackle our next question?
No, I think you covered it. I think, people are also, just from the end user perspective, getting more comfortable with the tools and with working from home. So I think that's a big part of it, not just the top-down approach, obviously, of, management making a decision to allow people to do that, but people getting comfortable with how they can be productive while working from home. So I think we are going to see some changes, at all levels. So the next question was, what is the best cloud provider? I'm wondering if this is a trick question because people know that we're a Microsoft partner, and obviously we do a lot with Azure, which is one of the major public cloud providers. But I guess the best way I could answer this one is it's the cloud that you do the best due diligence on, to give you a pure security answer. I think all of them have pretty much the same or equal capabilities, but it's a matter of how good your strategy is when going to cloud. That's going to make it the best cloud provider for you. So obviously we see from a market share perspective a lot more activity inside of Azure and AWS as the front runners, but we still have a lot of customers that are on private cloud and hybrid cloud environments as well. So our focus, primarily has been in traditionally the hybrid or private cloud environment, but we have a lot of customers that are their introduction to public cloud was Office 365 and other SaaS applications that have kind of had them take a harder look at what they can do with infrastructure in the public cloud space. So best cloud provider for your organization is the one that you take the time to strategize with. So Brian, anything to add there?
Again, I think you hit all the main points there, Nate. The only thing I would say, obviously, we are a Microsoft partner, and if you're using the Microsoft product suite, and if you're using on the Office applications and you're using O365 for email, who would be better at securing that than the people who built the technology themselves? So there's no way that your security operation in your average small business is going to be able to provide the scale and coverage and response that Microsoft is going to be. Obviously, there's a cost aspect there, but those are things to look at too. What other technologies, and if you can leverage something like that where it's a vendor developed technology and a vendor hosted cloud, that's probably a good combination. Looks like the next question we have here is, what should we do about the security with Zoom, security concerns of Zoom? So obviously that's been a lot. I think we talked about earlier that Zoom users might have been a spike from maybe 10 million users a month to 200 million users a month. It's being used by schools. It's being used by companies. It's being used by individuals connecting with their friends. And obviously there's been a lot of concerns about that. Security concerns that made the headlines. So these have gone in all sorts of directions. I want to say, it's important when you talk about these remote work technologies and capabilities, whether it's Zoom or Microsoft Teams or a GoToMeeting or a Cisco WebEx, all of these things are designed with collaboration in mind. That means, ease of use, ease of implementation, ease of information sharing, all the things that, from a security guy make, the hairs on the back of my neck, obviously on the top of my head, stand up. So with Zoom, they've done actually a pretty decent job of trying to respond and start to address some of these concerns. There's been, if you're a Zoom user now, you're seeing all these updates. Every time you come out of a meeting, there's a different update. So they are doing their piece, but obviously it's a lot to try to ask them to ingest all these different users, this incredible amount of traffic that they have, and also be, nailing down the security as they're doing that process. So I think, the current stance on Zoom would be, you can still use that platform. It's a great collaboration tool. One of the advantages of it is that compared to other remote meeting tools, it allows you to have a lot of people on screen at the same time. But the other side of that is we know these security concerns exist. And while Zoom is still in the process of addressing them, maybe if you're having your more private conversations, you wouldn't use Zoom for that platform. You would use something that's more restrictive, something that would allow you to ensure that any information that you're sharing through either a chat or over that video or phone call is truly secured, and only the people that you want on that chat and on that call are able to access that information. So that would be the take on Zoom currently. Don't not use it. Just understand that those risks exist, and keep that in mind with the nature of the information that you're sharing over those channels. If you're having an extremely sensitive conversation, maybe just have fall back on a tradition.
Looks like we might have lost Brian there. So, oh, there he is. Brian, you dropped out for a little bit and made a face at all of us. So we're just going to breeze through to the next question. There's actually only a couple more questions. Armando had asked about a one pager for some of the security challenges, work from home, remote work. There is actually one through KnowBe4, but we can provide that after this conference. That's the one we've used to kind of give a quick overview of what those challenges are. And then the last two questions come from Howard about security. Moving from the moat and castle model to kind of the endpoint and things like that, and is there a way to pen test laptops? There's definitely a way to pen test laptops. They're typically included if they're connected to the LAN when we're doing a pen test, but there's also a way to do kind of control reviews on endpoint detection products. We do a lot of proof of concept testing using the MITRE ATT&CK framework for that. So if anybody is implementing endpoint detection, they can do the fine tuning alongside us. Sometimes it's called purple team. It's a combination of red and blue team, obviously. So we have done that service for a lot of people, because that is controlling and protecting the endpoint is becoming more and more paramount as we go here. Second question, as a follow-up, Howard also asked about cloud-based applications and the need, obviously, if organizations are largely cloud-based, what are the other controls? Is a control like OpenVPN something that would be required on every laptop? And certainly something to consider, either having your own VPN or hosting it somewhere. There's a lot of different services for that. You can do that in public cloud as well. But in controlling to a certain degree the connectivity, pushing down content filtering policies, network access control policies, and things like that through an appliance or a virtual appliance is definitely something you'll want to consider. It can also be done at the endpoint through application control and endpoint detection and response as well. But again, that's just a decision of where you want to apply your controls. But definitely, whether or not you have infrastructure on premise, you do want to have some degree of control and visibility over, internet connectivity on your endpoints. So. Brian, I don't know, you had anything to add to that, but we're coming right up against the hour here. So,
no, I think, again, you hit all the key points there. Definitely thank you for everyone that tuned in and their time and attention today. Obviously Nate and I, as well as all of GraVoc and, the GraVoc Information Security team, we're here to be resources. In this time, there's a lot of challenges that different organizations are facing, again, at different levels. And so, any of those questions, we're happy to help and figure out, maybe you just need us, to bounce some ideas off of, or point you in the right direction, or, maybe you need a little bit, more guidance in that. And, whatever that is, we want to help everyone through this situation. We, again, are fortunate enough to be a technology company that can do things like these remote webinars and keep our business going, and we want everybody else to be able to do the same. So stay safe, and let us know if you need any help.
Absolutely. Yeah, we appreciate you guys taking the time to join us today. And obviously we're here for any information security related service, but definitely want to make sure that everybody is, healthy and safe first and foremost. So please keep us updated with kind of how things are going on your end, and we'll do the same. Thanks again.